Hi, anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and today we're going to talk about the Eastland Disaster in Chicago in 1915. And this was unintentional. Last week I talked about the ghost ship of the Northumberland Strait. I didn't really think about it when I was picking this one that we're going into another ship. But this is a very, very different type of story. And I first learned about the Eastland disaster from an episode of So Weird on the Disney Channel way back in the day. And I think it was actually the pilot episode of that. And then years later, after completely forgetting about that, I was on a walking tour in Chicago and they mentioned it again. And now every time that I'm in that area of Chicago, I think about it. I've seen a ton of pictures and a lot still really does kind of look the same. So it's something that is kind of in my mind quite a bit. So I figured it's a good time to cover it. Most people are familiar with the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. The Titanic had more than 1,500 deaths, and over 800 of those deaths were passengers, and nearly 700 were crew members. I think we can all agree that the sinking of the Titanic is incredibly tragic, and it clearly captured people's attention. Now, in modern time, whether it's a James Cameron film, a documentary, history class, everyone seems to be aware of the history. But another ship accident that is not as well discussed is the Eastland Disaster in 1915 in the Chicago River. So let's start by just discussing the SS Eastman. The ship was a steamer that was built in 1902, and it was originally designed to hold 500 passengers. Not long after being constructed, modifications were made to increase the passenger capacity, and these modifications actually made the ship less stable. In a Smithsonian article, the steamer was compared to a bike, saying that it wasn't very stable during the loading and unloading process, but once it actually started moving, it was very smooth and stable at that point. But while investigators were looking into the history of the SS Eastman, they discovered that there were multiple instances where the ship had nearly capsized. And the first one was in 1904. It had 3,000 passengers aboard. And remember, it was originally designed to only hold 50 and it was modified to be able to hold more. And then at that point, with the 3,000 passengers, it nearly capsized. And then 2 years later, in 1906, it was holding 2,530 passengers and nearly capsized again. And according to the Smithsonian, passengers seem to be pretty well aware of the danger of the SS Eastman, but it seems like the inspectors didn't really know because they kept giving the steamer the all clear. And it gained a very negative reputation overall. And unfortunately, St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company seemed to be very much unaware of its reputation when they purchased the ship in 1914. And an official from the company had testified saying that he was unaware of the reputation, but he just knew it was a great deal on the ship and that he was essentially only responsible for writing the checks. And apparently, they hadn't even taken the time to consider why it could be such a great deal. So on July 24th, 1915, Western Electric of Hawthorne was having their annual company picnic. And a little history on Western Electric was it was the largest electrical manufacturer in the United States, and it employed thousands of people. In 1878 and 1879, Western Electric was in a battle with Bell Telephone over Alexander Graham Bell's telephone patent application. And then in 1881, Bell won the patent war and purchased a majority share of Western Electric, making Western Electric's parent company Bell Telephone, which would later become known as AT&T. And in 1905, Western Electric opened their Hawthorne location, and the Hawthorne location was operated until 1986. And in its heyday, it had 45,000 employees at that one location. I'm not entirely sure what year it had its highest employment, but it's pretty clear that there were always thousands and thousands of employees working at Western Electric at Hawthorne. And the annual picnic was a really big deal. At the time of the Eastland Disaster in 1915, it was expected that employees of Western Electric worked 6 days a week. And when it came time for the picnic, employees were very excited to have a Saturday to relax. And this wasn't just like a picnic, this was a huge event. Western Electric hired multiple ships to take their employees across the southern end of Lake Michigan to Michigan City, Indiana, for a fancy beach day. And one of the ships they hired was the SS Eastman, which was 275 feet long and at the time could hold up to 2,500 passengers. Employees were allowed to bring their whole families, and tickets were sold for 75 cents in advance and $1 the day of. And as I was saying, this isn't just a beach day. Really, reading about it, it feels more like a gala. There was a ton of food and live music and dancing and sporting events. And a lot of people described it as the type of event to buy a fancy outfit for, or parents to buy suits and dresses for their kids. And for the employees who didn't have families, this was a really great way for coworkers to get to know each other, and really a way for single people to meet other single people. And to put this into perspective a little bit with the cost of the tickets, and families loved this event. In 1915, they sold over 7,000 tickets in advance, and Western Electric had to increase the number of ships they were going to use to transport everyone to Michigan City. And the SS Eastman, as I mentioned, was one of the 4 ships that they hired for that year's event. And on July 24th, employees and their families began to line up early because the boarding started at 6:30 a.m. And the first ship was planned to depart at 7:30 a.m., which was the SS Eastman. One picnic attendee said that their family woke up at 4:30 to make sure that they were able to arrive downtown Chicago around 6 so that they could get in line. And the boarding location was between Clark and LaSalle along the south bank of the Chicago River. And as I mentioned, each ship had the capacity of 2,500 people plus crew, which was typically less than 100 for the crew. And they were actually boarding people about 50 people per minute. And while everyone was boarding, the event had begun to kick off. There was live ragtime music that greeted the attendees, and many guests began to dance along after boarding. And at this point, it also had started to rain. So a lot of the passengers also were trying to go into lower decks and cabins to avoid the rain. But as the ship began to fill with passengers, it began to lean or list. And it would go back and forth between the port and starboard side, just rocking. And it would lean a little bit more towards the port side, which was the side of the river. And the starboard side would be the side where all the passengers were loading in from the street. And so as it would rock, it would dip a little bit more towards port than starboard. And many picnic attendees didn't even really notice this too much at the beginning. And those who did kind of found it fun and a part of the experience being on a ship. Some even thought that it might kind of be a joke and potentially done intentionally or on purpose. And as people boarded the ship, the list became more extreme. And people actually started sliding across the deck because it was such a steep angle, they couldn't keep their balance. And it was raining, so the deck was actually wet. And this is when people began to realize how severe of an issue this could be if it wasn't quickly corrected. And some passengers began to panic. It was at this point that the ship was ordered to be placed at even keel, which means correcting the ship so that it was level in the water and not tilting in either direction. This is done by filling chambers called ballasts with water inside of the ship to help balance that weight. The ship was corrected and they continued to load passengers until they reached their 2,500 passenger limit for the SS Eastman around 7:10 a.m. Between passengers and crew, there were a total of 2,573 people on board. At 7:20 a.m., the ship began to list again, favoring the port side. In addition, additional ballast tanks were filled in an attempt to correct that list again, but the tilt was so bad that water began to enter the main deck through a scupper, which is a hole at the deck that is designed to drain water from on the deck. And like in my head, I'm going back to Indiana Jones for this. It's usually at the bottom of the railing. And if you remember in Indiana Jones on the Last Crusade, in the kind of second scene, I guess, after they're on the train and Indy's a teenager, he becomes an adult and he's in this big fight over a cross. And the cross gets tossed into a fight onto the deck and nearly slides off the ship through a small hole at the bottom of the railing. But Indy grabs it right before it goes overboard. That's a scupper. And so water was actually coming in through those holes. So that hole was actually essentially at water level with how severe the tilt was on the ship. And in an attempt to correct the list faster, since multiple ballast tanks had already been filled, passengers were asked to move to the starboard side of the deck. Unfortunately, it was too late at this point to correct the list and depart the river safely into Lake Michigan. Water had begun to flow in through the gangways on the port side of the ship, and Captain Henry Pedersen issued a warning to the crew and engine room and basically told them to be on standby and to not depart as scheduled so they can figure this out. And by this point, the stern or rear of the ship had already begun to swing away into the river along from the road, which made the bow swing towards the river wall, towards the road, and the ship was essentially just floating on an angle in the Chicago River. By 7:27 a.m., ship crew members began to head to the upper deck, realizing that the list towards the port side was too severe and that they were actually in an incredibly dangerous situation. Water was coming into the ship due to the lists, and passengers were asked again to move towards the starboard side. But now, with the rain and the additional water coming in, the deck was very wet and it was very difficult to get traction to move far enough to the starboard side to make a difference. In addition to the chaos of the situation and passengers beginning to panic, many passengers didn't even hear these instructions. And by 7:28 a.m., the list was at 45 degrees. And 90 degrees would mean that the ship was fully lying on its side. So 45 degrees is an incredibly extreme list. And according to eastlanddisaster.org, dishes were falling off its shelves. A piano that was on the desk slid to the port side, almost crushing two women. And one or two women were pinned by a refrigerator that had slid across the deck as well. And passengers were fully panicked by this time and began to rush to the stairs that led to the upper decks, while others were just abandoning the ship and jumping off. And with water rushing in on the port side, people jumping out the ship, it just really created even more imbalance, and the ship at this point had fully tipped over onto its side. And on eastlanddisaster.org, they have a couple first-hand accounts of the ship tipping over. One witness who was on the Eastland, he said that it rolled over and afterwards described his experience saying, quote, What I saw is exactly what you see when you watch a lot of children rolling down the side of a hill. The entire crowd of men, women, and children came slipping and sliding and sprawling in a mass of lunchboxes, milk bottles, chairs, rubbish of every sort on top of them. They came in a floundering and screaming mass, and the boat turned completely on its side, crushed into the stairs, carrying them away. And people who were rushing to the staircase on the port side trying to get to the higher deck had been stuck, and unfortunately, many had been crushed or trapped when the ship capsized. A total of 844 people died in the Eastland Disaster, which was the most deadly shipwreck in the Great Lakes. And while there were half the casualties of the Titanic, the Eastland Disaster had less than 100 crew members on board, and the disaster took more passengers' lives than the Titanic had. The SS Eastman did have lifeboats and rafts and life vests, but due to the speed of the ship capsizing, none of them had the ability to be utilized in time. And after the Titanic sank in 1912, a movement began that was called Lifeboats for All, which led the U.S. to passing laws that required lifeboats and rafts for at least 75% of the passengers and the crew, in addition to the life vests. These additional boats were typically stored on or along the upper decks, but this now made the ship very top-heavy with all of the added weight. And in addition to the lifeboats being over 1,000 pounds each, and each life vest being about 6 pounds, that's a ton of extra weight added above the water level, which adds to the imbalance of the ship. And as we discussed earlier, they modified the SS Eastman to allow more passengers on board, and those modifications also made the ship less balanced. So now we have a lot of things working together that attributed to why the ship had listed to begin with. Imagine an iceberg. Approximately 90% of icebergs are below the water's surface, which means the majority of the weight is below the surface, and that helps keep the iceberg balanced in its spot. When it is reversed, only 10% of the iceberg being below the water's surface and 90% being above, it would struggle to keep balance in moving water, and it would end up likely tipping over and capsizing itself. And this is essentially what happened to the SS Eastman. In addition to the weight, thousands and thousands of pounds added above the water. It makes it much easier for it to list, and list severely, especially with the added movement of 2,500 plus people running around. It's obviously going to make it harder to correct. And as the SS Eastman was capsizing, the other ships that were hired for Western Electric's picnic were in the process of being loaded with passengers. And once they saw what happened to the Eastman, the passengers in the other ships began to panic. And they wanted off their ship as quickly as possible. So as the passengers wanted to get on land, crew members wanted to help. They started tossing life preservers into the water, and crew members got into lifeboats and tried to get as many people as possible out of the water. And there are so many stories of crew members who risked their own lives to save passengers. And one of them, that morning, there was a tugboat named the Kenosha that was docked in front of the Eastman, and it was going to help guide it out to Lake Michigan. And the captain of the Kenosha, John O'Meara, immediately ordered his tugboat to create a bridge from the bow of the Eastman to the wharf, and potentially saved hundreds of lives, in addition to everyone else who was jumping in the water and tossing as much as they could as flotation devices. And 15-year-old Jack James Billow was one of the crew members from one of the other ships who immediately got into the lifeboat and started pulling people from the water. And Peter Boyle from one of the ships jumped into the water after seeing a woman unable to swim. And I just want to take a moment to remind everyone of the timing here. This is 1915. Women's fashion was in a transition from more of an Edwardian dress, which had a ton of fabric, lots of different layers, into more of a roaring 20s style where women wore less layers, a little bit lighter fabric. But this was also a big day of celebration. This was the reason to wear your nice fancy dress. And most women had many different layers, and trying to swim in that much fabric is incredibly difficult. And that's even to say if they knew how to swim. I've seen many, many photos of the disaster, and it's incredibly eerie. I think everyone looking at these images will likely feel the same. But as a Chicagoan and having a great interest in history, and most specifically Chicago history, it's even more seeing the city that I recognize and the buildings and bridges that are still there today that I literally see every day, with a ship fully tipped over, sticking out of the water. And in the area of the river where the Eastland had capsized, it's only about 20 feet deep. So there was a lot of the ship that was above the water. And I'll be very careful when I'm posting photos to not include any deceased victims. But just know, if you do choose to look at these pictures, many of which are on the eastlanddisaster.org, many of them do include deceased victims. So if that is something that you really prefer not to see, I don't recommend checking it out. But I'll make sure that on our socials, those photos are not included. And the businesses right along the bank of the river also jumped into action to try to help people. They began tossing things into the water, such as empty crates, so that people had something to hold on to and keep them afloat. And restaurants and hotels and stores all became places for survivors to go and get warm. And if they could provide, they would give them sandwiches and coffee and blankets. And Marshall Field's, which was one of the largest department stores in the world, I believe at this time it actually was the largest department store in the world. And it is a Chicago historical staple. If you were born in or before the 90s and you're from Chicago, Marshall Field's was likely a staple in your childhood. I know it was definitely for mine. But the store donated tons of linens and blankets for survivors, and they also donated a ton so that they could respectfully cover up those who had died during the disaster, so that there weren't bodies everywhere that people just could walk by, because there was just such chaos at the scene that they were doing their best to keep things organized. But you have thousands of people involved in this, and this all happened within minutes. And right by the river, there were some welders who were currently working when the ship had capsized, and they quickly jumped into action. They dragged all of their gear over to the Eastman and began cutting open the hull of the ship in an attempt to get the people who were trapped inside out. But the Eastman's captain, Harry Pedersen, began to order the welders to stop, saying that they were damaging and ruining the ship. And quickly, bystanders who had witnessed the disaster and were already immediately blaming the captain for not acting quick enough and having this happen began to intervene. And they called for the captain to be lynched or drowned. And before this scene turned into an angry mob versus the chaotic support that it currently was, the police had arrested the captain. And many witnesses say that if the police had not arrested him, they believe that the crowd would have killed him. And the Reed Murdoch and Company building, which is right along the river, had opened its doors as a makeshift trauma center and morgue. The first floor was to treat survivors, and the basement was used as the morgue. And there were people who would volunteer to embalm the deceased in the basement of the building. And it really wasn't just the local businesses who were helping. Many bystanders helped. Even a young boy on a paper route jumped into the river to save passengers. And there were many people on the area who were observing the scene, so the police and fire department had to kind of do crowd control. I even read in some articles that there were people who were like chartering boats, and you could like purchase a seat on the boat so you could go by the Eastman and see what it was like, and they were basically selling tickets to this disaster. But throughout the day and rescue efforts, they had turned into recovery efforts. And police and firefighters were a bit out of their depth with the recovery, but they were able to aid divers who were willing to go in and try to navigate the ship along with the riverbed all around it to find as many victims of the disaster as possible. One diver, 17-year-old Charles R.E. Bowles, was given the nickname from veteran divers of the human frog after he pulled 40 bodies out of the river. In addition to the tragic disaster, another issue quickly became apparent in Chicago's Department of Health. Anyone who had contact with the river water had to receive an anti-typhoid treatment. If there was any risk of anyone swallowing river water, there was a great risk of contacting typhoid fever. So the city had to issue hundreds of inoculations. And in the days following the disaster, many professional divers went into the capsized ship to continue looking for bodies of the disaster victims. And those divers wore lead boots and belts to help them sink and to navigate throughout the ship. And those divers also needed assistance on shore because they didn't have oxygen tanks like we do now. They needed these assistants to hand pump oxygen from the shore through tubes to the divers inside of the ship below the water surface. And these divers had to navigate the ship underwater, and navigating the ship would have been difficult in a swimsuit, but these weighted suits were incredibly large. And then you had the tubes connected to the surface for the oxygen supply. So they had to move around all of this debris and things while navigating and making sure that they're still connected to their oxygen tubes. And they said that they were going around all different sorts of debris, such as picnic baskets and parasols and stuffed animals, which just sounds terrifying. And the public's response was overwhelming. We've already talked about so many different people from unrelated to the ship or Western Electric just jumping in and helping in every way. And it's because everyone was shocked about this disaster, and even more shocked in how quickly it all happened. The captain from another tugboat named the Indiana, Captain Joseph Lamoureux, said that for many years he had nightmares about the disaster, and he wasn't able to talk about it with friends or family. And while doing my research, I found all sorts of comments like this over and over. Police officer Patrick Lally spent about 20 hours in the river that day, and when he finally returned home, he sat down and he broke down crying. And his family said that this was the first time they had ever seen him cry. And while the history of the Eastland disaster is certainly available, it's from my understanding that there's also an exhibit downtown right now. We have a Titanic exhibit going on, and that they've dedicated some space to the Eastland disaster. But there's so many people who have never heard this part of Chicago history. And I think a part of it is because how difficult it was for survivors to discuss it. In the days and weeks following the disaster, Chicago really came together to support the communities and the families of the victims. Since this was supposed to be a fun outing for Western Electric employees, there was no actual manifest. So Western Electric had set up multiple centers to help coordinate identifications. And due to the type of immediate response from anyone who could help survivors and victims, they were really very much spread out throughout the city. It wasn't an organized effort immediately. It was just try to save as many people as possible if you can. So it was incredibly difficult to identify who was on the SS Eastman, and most specifically who had died in the tragedy. Remember, this was a lot of families. And unfortunately, every member of some families had died in this disaster. So it was difficult to get these identifications because there weren't other people there to be able to do it. So Western Electric set up these multiple sites to help this identification process. And they also provided many vehicles for people so they could travel between these different locations to help coordinate the efforts even further. Also, Western Electric was committed to helping families of the employees who had died. They allocated $100,000. And again, this is 1915 at the point. But they allocated $100,000 to help pay for rent and food, in addition to funeral clothing and cemetery and burial costs for any of the families who had lost loved ones. And while Western Electric is helping families who were their employees, the American Red Cross had also set up a response centers for those who were not employees. And they helped provide additional stretchers and beds free of charge for the Reed, Murdoch and Company building that was being used as that trauma center and morgue. And the Red Cross was providing services for people who were still in distress after the disaster. And there were many people who were in shock from this, and they were actively passing out just due to the news. And so they were there to help aid those people as well. And the many volunteers who were becoming extremely exhausted and needed medical treatment themselves, the Red Cross was preparing to help all of those people. And in addition to them, all the local businesses who had helped set up food stations and volunteers, the food stations so that volunteers could keep up their energy and go back into the water and hopefully not risk their own health as much. And the day after, the Red Cross set up a response system for the victims who had been identified. And the Red Cross had also set up a response system for the victims who had been identified. Once an ID was made, a nurse, physician, and interpreter hopped into a car that was waiting for them and immediately took them to the family's home. They were given the immediate support, and they even brought money with them so that they could give them immediate financial support until more information could be provided for those families. And the American Red Cross kept an office at Western Electric Hawthorne facility for a week after the disaster, which they eventually ended up moving downtown. But this was so that they could provide additional and more long-term support. They had also been provided with a $15,000 grant to provide for those families for funerals, rent, food, just general support for those who had been affected. Very similar to how Western Electric helped victims of the families of their employees. And then in addition to the $15,000, the Red Cross had raised an additional $200,000 in the days following the disaster. And then within a few weeks of the disaster, they raised an additional $200,000. And they made the decision to not just donate the money, a certain amount of money per each family, just divide it by the total of people who are affected. They actually assessed each family's financial needs to ensure that they were covered. So the families who did not need as much financial support received a bit less, to ensure that no family was struggling financially. And funeral homes did everything that they could to support the community. And they worked tirelessly to care for the victims and show respect. But many of them didn't have the support they needed, such as vehicles to transport the bodies. Many funeral homes were still using a horse and buggy for transportation, but the horses were getting very worn and tired from the consistent trips to the cemeteries. So Marshall Fields loaned 39 company trucks to the local funeral homes, and cemeteries hired dozens of men to dig graves. Typically, 2 grave diggers would take 4 hours to dig one grave, but they had 844 deaths in the disaster. So the cemeteries, which would typically have 2 to 4 grave diggers, had to hire more than 50 people to help support the sudden need for additional graves. And a few days after the disaster, there was a baseball game at Wegman Field, which would later become known as Wrigley Field, and all tickets sold were to support the victims and their families. And it wasn't only the people in the stands who bought tickets that day. The players, the coaches, the announcers, the umps, they all decided to purchase tickets as well so that they could raise as much money as possible for those who needed it. And going through all of this research, it was incredibly sad to see so many casualties. But as a Chicagoan, I'm proud of this response and the sense of community. Truly everyone who really had come together, and they didn't really expect anything in return. They saw people in need, and they did everything they could, like with the exception of the people who were selling tickets to view it. I don't agree with that, but there was a lot in this research where it was kind of hard for me to stop because it was sad but inspiring. And I strongly recommend everyone go check out eastlanddisaster.org. I'll have it linked in the show notes. There was also a fantastic article on the Smithsonian that discusses a lot more in depth of kind of the ship itself. And they went more into kind of the chaos of the day. They're the ones who talked about the people purchasing the tickets to view it. But I highly recommend it. If you are interested in history, this is something that I definitely think is fascinating. It's very sad, but I would definitely recommend checking it out. We'll post all the pictures on our Instagram. Obviously, I'll try to be very careful about posting any of the deceased victims. But I hope you all enjoyed this episode. We are very close to having all 50 states listening. We just have a couple states left. So I am going to ask that you all share this episode with somebody. And whether that's international or not, I would love to see a ton of new countries on our listeners. But yeah, I ask that you share our episodes, and we hope to have some new people checking in and learning more about this history and the crimes that we talk about. But I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and thank you for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, or you can follow our show on Spotify. You can now find us on YouTube at Have You Heard About This Case, on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.